Good evening, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're doing very well tonight. We've got another Modern Horizons 2 spoiler for you. This is a tantalizing, potentially very powerful, certainly wide-ranging in what it hoses hate piece. It is called Void Mirror, and we are here to answer the most asked question on this channel, will it rock? Now, as we break it down, note that I will be thinking mostly about this as it pertains to Boomer Rock. Not so much to Cat Rock, not so much to Jund, maybe not even to white-black mid-range decks like Abzan or Dead Guy Ale, potentially good for like Rakdos mid-range as well, but we are focusing mostly on those two-color decks without Lurrus, without Bloodbraid Elf, and without white cards. All of those reasons I think will become apparent as we break it down. This is a hot take fresh off the presses. This came out about 15-20 minutes ago. I have looked at a couple people's thoughts and I'm just diving right in with my own. So, Void Mirror, will it rock? Thank you for watching. Let's find out. Void Mirror is an artifact for 2 generic mana, meaning there are no color restrictions on who can register this card, and it reads, whenever a player casts a spell, if no colored mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. Let's read that again. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no colored mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. Now, that is quite momentous in terms of the text. Number 1, anybody can play it. Number 2, you are obviously, if you're anything like me, your first thought is that, well, this is a Tron hoser. Of course, these decks making 7 colorless mana on turn 3 a great deal of the time, only to have everything countered by your turn 2, Void Mirror. So that is probably where most people's minds go first. Let's talk about its role to begin with in hosing colorless strategies. So of course there is Tron. Don't get me wrong, this is definitely pretty good against Tron. Sometimes they will be using their cantrips early on. So Chromatic Star is the obvious out to this. Maybe they make Tron on turn 3, they deploy a Chromatic Star, and then they make green, and okay, well, I guess they can still kind of go off, right? But often enough, especially if you're a mid-range deck disrupting them with discard spells, they'll be cracking stars early on, trying to find Ancient Stirring, Sylvan Scrying, trying to set up Tron in the first place, only to then assemble it and not have any way to cast anything through Void Mirror. That can definitely happen. Is this a reliable hate piece against Tron? I don't exactly know, because between that concern we just mentioned, between the fact that Tron is perfectly happy, especially against a mid-range deck, to simply, even deploy a forest if the case may call for that in order to play a bit of a slower game, maybe cast their payoffs on turn 4, or even just hard casting them like they're used to doing in the face of our land destruction in a more fair way, it's definitely not a panacea, because remember, friends, against Tron, if you don't have a clock, you are still in big, big trouble, and Void Mirror is not a clock. In fact, it is a static hate piece. That is the opposite of a clock. Static hate pieces are notoriously poor fits in mid-range decks. For that reason, they do not generate value. They might represent a hard lock, or they might just be dealt with, or they might not line up, or they might be a bad top deck. It goes on and on and on. It's also a 2-drop. I'm more okay with a static hate piece in theory at the 1-drop slot, because sometimes you don't have discard, or sometimes you have 2 discard spells, and either way you can be very efficient in the early turns, either going hate piece into threat, or discard into discard plus hate piece in the first 2 turns. Void Mirror is competing with a lot of other very powerful plays, so I think you would absolutely bring it in against Tron, but is it enough? Is it enough to hose Tron to put this card in your deck? Frankly, possibly not, but let's go on. What about Eldrazi Tron? Now, they're going to have a much tougher time dealing with this because they don't play the cantrips, they don't play those eggs that filter their colors into green, and they don't play any colored basic lands. The basic lands they play are limited, and they are wastes. And yes, they could change their mana base a little bit to accommodate that if they are afraid of this card, but that will also be a nerf to the deck. It really would. It may be not a substantial, massive nerf or anything, but it would absolutely represent a downgrade in the deck's power level and efficiency. However, even if they make no changes whatsoever, don't respect Void Mirror in the least. We have Cavern of Souls out of Eldrazi Tron, which can, of course, get through the triggered ability that is Counter Magic, Cavern of Souls, not only making color, also making creature spells unable to be countered. So with all of that in mind, my friends, Void Mirror, definitely a decent card against these Tron decks. I think better against Eldrazi Tron than Green Tron, and better against Green Tron than Blue Tron, right? But absolutely not a panacea, as we say. However, the good news for people interested in this card, again, it's going to be pretty good there. It's going to be part of your game plan there, and it does so much more. So what else can Void Mirror do? Is it really that relevant against other artifacts, other colorless spells in the format? Maybe not quite so much, because if you look at Hardened Scales Affinity, number one, they make a lot of green mana, number two, they're not that much in the meta. Now, if you had this in your deck, would you bring it in against it? Maybe as a one-of, just for those starts where they're operating off of colorless lands, you can really slow them down, but even then, you'd need to look at their list and say, is this really going to do much? Of course, the temptation might be, okay, you can hose Ballista against Heliod. No, you can't. Remember, it has nothing to do with the color of the spell, and everything to do with the colors, or lack thereof, of the mana used to cast it. So with that in mind, it's like, okay, what else does this really do? Well, you have to think beyond the colorless concept, my friends, and start thinking about what if no mana whatsoever was spent to cast it? Well, those things get countered too. That's right, free spells getting countered too by Void Mirror, and that is where things get very interesting. Of course, Force of Negation is probably the premier free spell in Modern as things stand. It is certainly one of them, and we have all been there, where the blue deck, the blue value pile, I don't even want to call it a blue deck because half the time it's a 4 or 5 color monstrosity, they Force of Negation one of your more impactful spells. And as a mid-range player, you're like, okay, well, that kind of sucks. Really wanted that to resolve, right? But hey, we're a depletion deck, we're an attrition deck, that's a 2-for-1 in our favor, that's okay. And then they play like a billion cards that all draw a card, and the Force of Negation's downside is completely made up for, and then some, and in fact, it's the card that allowed them to stay in the game long enough to get that inevitability of value generation online. But Force of Negation cannot be free cast under a Void Mirror. Is this the only free spell in Modern, though? Not even close, my friends. We've got that As Foretold combo deck that is shutting off it's basically rendering As Foretold irrelevant, right? At least until they can deal with the Void Mirror, the free cast off As Foretold, those spells getting countered too. Sometimes you see Living End in those decks, more often they're like Restore Balance and similar cards, but Living End in any form, whether it be in the Restore Balance deck, in the traditional Jund version. Sorry, I had a bit of a coughing fit there, but yes, we are shutting off Living End. And how about some of the newer Suspend cards? Profane Tutor is an example of this, and we may also be getting Shardless Agent in Modern based on the leaks. So we're looking at Cascade spells and Suspend spells all together. Anything that is cast for free can fall victim to the Void Mirror. And also, if we're looking at new Modern Horizons 2 cards, whether confirmed or speculative, we have to recognize the Evoke cycle. There's been some hullabaloo about Grief. I myself have posited a Grief-based Dead Guy Ale list, a Grief Guy Ale list. Well, guess what? This is hate even against this free Evoke cycle, because you are not spending any mana to cast it for that Evoke cost. Therefore, Void Mirror going to police that as well, at least to some degree. Now, maybe Grief isn't the very best example, because player draw, the Grief player will be able to do the Grief thing if they have the whole combo as I outlined in my previous video lined up, right before Void Mirror hits the field. But hey, not everybody's got what they need on turn 1. This can still be relevant there turn 2 and beyond. Rounding out this thorough but certainly incomplete list of mid-range nemesis that Void Mirror can hose, we have Summoner's Pact. In the rest of this Pact cycle, no mana is spent to actually cast Summoner's Pact, therefore it will be countered. Doesn't matter if they intend to pay the mana back later, that is not how the card reads, not what the card cares about. Shelldock Isle and the Hideaway cycle of lands, granted they're not the most common in Modern, but if you incidentally have this card card in the deck for other reasons against those matchups. You can get a little bit of bonus action against Hideaway as well. And remember that the flashback of Lava Dart is also something that mana is not spent for. Void Mirror will counter that as well, and then you get into the free prowess spells, especially Mutagenic Growth, because often the decks playing Mutagenic Growth cannot actually make green mana, and therefore they depend on being able to cast this for 0 mana, and you could at least slow down Gut Shot in those red decks as well, even though they of course have the option to hard cast it. Now, granted, my friends, I don't advocate bringing in Void Mirror as a way to simply hose the back half of Lava Dart and maybe catch a stray Mutagenic Growth or 2 out. My point here is simply to drive home, number 1, how wide-ranging this effect is. Number 2, the fact that we are kind of future-proofing ourselves against other unforeseen free spells in the future. And number 3, that this is a role player. It is not necessarily a hard hoser of any one strategy, except maybe those that are all in on suspend cards. But what it does do is flex into a wide variety of roles in a really, really unique way. We're talking about getting repeated triggers, kind of Chalice of the Void style counterlocks out of a mid-range deck. It's something that we just simply have never really had access to before in Modern. Almost forgot a pretty important one these days at Spring Delight. This is in 5-color Niv. It's in the Scape Shift piles, not the traditional red-green Scape Shift, of course, but the 4-color, 5-color piles. Again, is this definitely the hate card du jour against those decks? Probably not. Is it a potentially good role player depending on your 75 and what else the opponent is up to that Void Mirror might hose? I would say so. Now, for the bad news, for the good news and the bad news, for the mixed bag, I should say, this is going to also hose cards that we play as mid-range players, and the first one that comes immediately to mind is Mishra's Bauble. And this is why at the beginning I said I'm conceiving of this as like a Boomer Rock or a Rakdos mid-range card more than anything, because if you're talking about Cat Rock, well, sorry to say, your own Mishra's Baubles are going to get countered by Void Mirror. You forgot to spend mana. You forgot to spend mana to cast that cantrip. Sorry, it's going to get countered. No value for you. And then, of course, just like it is a potential hoser for some of the combo decks that abuse the Cascade function, it is also a hoser for our beloved Jund that simply wants to Bloodbraid Elf into a Liliana. Ultimate fair play, not allowed under the auspices of the Void Mirror. Very sad times. And the other thing that I'll mention that's a little bit of a non-bo, so cast your mind back to the beginning of this segment, or near the beginning of the video, where we talked about hosing Tron. Well, there is a little bit of a non-bo here, like, of course, against Tron. If you're playing Assassin's Trophy, you want to trophy the Tron lands early to break that up, maybe even start basic taxing them out of the game against Eldrazi Tron. But if you're, and that might still be live, right, if they don't really adapt their land base to this by playing a straight forest or whatever. But if you are doing this against Green Tron, you are actually kind of giving them their out to the Void Mirror. So Assassin's Trophy and Void Mirror, both good, for sure, against Green Tron, neither a panacea, and also working a little bit at cross purposes. Just a little bit of food for thought there. Alright guys, so like I said, this is a video I've made very soon after this came out. I just basically skimmed a discussion or two, went off the top of my head, and let it rip, so by nature, this will have been an incomplete list. I encourage you, any other things that this might hose that you think are relevant, worth mentioning, please leave them in the comments below. Now, as far as will this rock, I'm not actually sure. I think it is so unique and so powerful that if you're not playing any of the aforementioned non-bows, except maybe Assassin's Trophy, right? If you have both, I guess that's a good thing. You just choose kind of which strategy to follow, or maybe even play both, you know, it can't hurt if you have nothing better to do, I guess, right? But in any case, if you're not on Lurrus, if you're not on Bloodbraid Elf, why not play a Void Mirror or two? I really think it does enough. It does have win potential against the big mana decks. It has even higher win potential against the Suspend decks in all the various forms that I expect them to be around in the modern landscape post MH2. And beyond that, it is an interesting and potentially powerful role player against decks that really depend perhaps on one or preferably more of the more ancillary host cards that we mentioned in this video. So that's the upside. The other upside is that, again, it's just strong and cool for a mid-range deck to have access to this kind of prison style piece, specifically one that polices opposing degeneracy by using counter that spell as a phrase. It's just not one that we often get to employ. That in and of itself is unique and also appealing, but the downsides are kind of real. The downsides are that this is not probably the strongest hate piece that you could bring to bear against most strategies. Against most strategies, this is kind of a tier 2 hate piece. Now, if you cover enough of those, then maybe that's fine, and maybe it is tier 1, from the modern card pool against 1 or 2 strategies. It'll all depend on the metagame, right? But the downside is that, and also the fact that, again, it is a static hate piece. Mid-range is traditionally not the very best home for static hate pieces. Static hate pieces are a little bit better served in decks that don't care quite as much about their clock, or decks that have a really fast clock and just need to stick one hate piece while racing. Mid-range being kind of in the middle of that spectrum means that we need every piece to kind of pull its weight. You know, Collector Roof, Plague Engineer, Auric Champion, these are great examples of cards that can turn sideways and hose the opponent at the same time. That's usually more the type of thing that we need, but Void Mirror, a very intriguing one. Don't sleep on it. Very exciting, potentially well-designed card, and we'll see how it all plays out. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate that, and let me know what you think about this card in the comments below. I'll talk to you for the next spoiler, I'm sure, tomorrow or very soon after that. Take care, guys, and I'll see you soon.